Imagine being so hungry that the sight of bread makes you risk everything. A desperate child, ragged and starving, dares to enter the royal ball searching for nothing more than a crust to ease the pain in his empty stomach. Instead, he finds humiliation and cruelty as nobles mock him, guards seize him, and he's dragged away like garbage. But then, everything changes in a heartbeat. An elderly lady gasps, her trembling finger pointing at the boy's face. "Those eyes," she whispers, "they are the eyes of the king." The entire court freezes, nobles stare in disbelief, and for one electric moment, the king himself locks gazes with the child across the crowded hall. Could this filthy beggar boy truly be of royal blood? And if he is, what devastating secrets will be unearthed that threaten not just the royal succession, but the entire kingdom? More importantly, what happens when a king must finally face the consequences of a love he abandoned years ago? The moment the fragile wooden doors of the great hall creaked open, a child's ragged silhouette stood trembling against the overwhelming splendor. Blood drained from his hollow cheeks as hundreds of jewel-adorned eyes turned to stare. The music, moments ago filling the cavernous space with joyous melodies, stuttered to silence as if someone had crushed the very breath from the musician's lungs. The boy's stomach twisted with a pain sharper than the hunger that had driven him here. His cracked lips parted slightly, not in awe of the nobility, but at the sight of bread. Golden, steam still rising, piled carelessly on silver platters as if it held no value at all. A single thought pounded behind his temples. Just one piece might stop the endless gnawing in his belly. The candlelight from 24 ornate chandeliers cast dancing shadows across his dirt-streaked face. His tattered clothing hung from his skeletal frame like autumn leaves clinging to winter branches, once perhaps blue, now the color of ash and earth. Between his bare toes, the polished marble floor felt impossibly cold, almost burning against skin accustomed only to mud and stone. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread pulled him forward like an invisible chain. A portly merchant, his fingers heavy with gold rings and his breath thick with wine, was the first to break the stunned silence. "What is this filth doing in His Majesty's feast?" His voice carried the smug certainty of someone who belonged in these hallowed halls, though the slight tremble in his jowls betrayed his own insecurity. Whispers rippled through the crowd, spreading like poison through water. Ladies clutched their elaborate gowns closer, as if the boy's poverty might somehow stain their silks. The boy's heart hammered against his ribs, a trapped bird in a too small cage. His gaze darted between the exits now blocked by guards with hands resting on sword hilts. He had not expected such hostility. In the village, when the baker occasionally tossed out day-old bread, children would scramble for the scraps without fear. Here, amid such abundance, he had thought perhaps kindness might flourish. The crushing realization that wealth bred not generosity but contempt made his throat tighten. "Please," he whispered, though the word barely escaped his lips. "I haven't eaten in 3 days." His voice sounded alien even to himself, thin, reedy, almost like the mewling of a kitten. The confession of weakness made his cheeks burn with shame. His father, before the fever took him, had always said a man should never beg. But his father had never known hunger like this. The merchant's face contorted into disgust, his nostrils flaring as if he could smell the poverty emanating from the child. With unexpected swiftness for his size, he strode forward and shoved the boy with enough force to send him sprawling onto the hard floor. Pain shot through the child's elbow as it struck marble, but he bit back tears. He'd learned long ago that crying only invited more cruelty. "Guards!" the merchant bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. "Remove this vermin before he infests us all!" 2 armored men stepped forward, their faces impassive beneath steel helmets. Their hands, calloused from years of training with sword and shield, gripped the boy's thin arms, lifting him as easily as one might lift a straw doll. The child did not struggle. Resistance would only make things worse. Around him, the nobility's laughter swelled, a symphony of mockery that pierced deeper than any physical pain. "I just wanted some bread," the boy murmured, gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet the eyes of those who found such amusement in his suffering. A single tear escaped despite his efforts, carving a clean path down his dirt-stained cheek. He could feel every heartbeat in his throat now. each one a reminder that he was alive, but perhaps would not remain so much longer. Winter approached, and without food. The guards dragged him toward the massive entry doors, his bare feet scraping against the ornate floor patterns. The nobles had already begun to lose interest, turning back to their conversations and cups. Music tentatively resumed, as if testing whether the interruption had truly passed. The boys' momentary intrusion into their world would be forgotten before the night's end, just another amusing anecdote to share over wine. As they neared the exit, an elderly lady in faded finery, once grand but now merely respectable, stepped forward from the edge of the gathering. Unlike the others, her face showed neither disgust nor amusement, but a peculiar intensity. Her rheumy eyes narrowed as she peered at the child's face, and her frail hand reached out as if to touch him before drawing back uncertainly. "Wait," she said, her voice cracking with age yet carrying a hint of authority that made the guards hesitate. "Bring him closer to the light." The guards exchanged glances but complied, turning the boy toward a nearby candelabra. The old woman's fingers trembled as she tilted his chin upward. The boy tried to pull away. The intimacy of the gesture from a stranger felt more invasive than the merchant's shove, but her grip was surprisingly firm. "Those eyes," she whispered, barely audible above the renewed music and conversation. Her own eyes widened with a shock that seemed to age her and rejuvenate her simultaneously. She took a small, staggering step backward. The shape, the color. The boy's confusion only deepened. What was wrong with his eyes? They were just eyes, the same ones that had watched his mother die, that had witnessed countless cruelties in the village, that had learned to scan for danger and opportunity with equal vigilance. Yet this woman stared at them as if they contained some terrible secret. The lady's voice dropped even lower, forcing the nearby nobles to lean closer. Her next words fell into the space between them like stones into still water. "They are the eyes of the king." Time seemed to freeze. The boy felt a strange tingling sensation spread through his limbs. The guard's grip on his arm slackened momentarily in their surprise. The handful of nobles close enough to hear the old woman's words stopped mid-conversation, glasses of wine suspended halfway to lips, forks laden with meat hovering between plate and mouth. The king himself, seated at the high table beneath a canopy of royal blue, turned his gaze toward the commotion. His expression, previously one of detached boredom, shifted subtly, a tightening around the eyes, a slight parting of lips. For one heartbeat, then two, then three, his eyes met the boy's across the vast expanse of the hall. Something electric and unnameable passed between them, a recognition that transcended explanation. The boy could not understand it, but he felt it in his marrow, an awakening of something that had always slept within him, waiting for this moment. And in that frozen instant of terrible possibility, as the hall held its collective breath, the boy realized that his life, his identity, his past, his future, teetered on the precipice of a truth too enormous to comprehend. The silence that followed the old woman's declaration hung in the air like a physical weight, pressing down on every chest in the vast hall. The old lady's words, "They are the eyes of the king," seemed to echo despite having been barely whispered, as if the very stones of the castle wanted to preserve and amplify her revelation. The boy stood frozen, small and vulnerable in the center of a widening circle as nobles instinctively stepped back, creating a theatrical space that framed him like an accused criminal awaiting judgment. Lady Elspeth, for that was the elderly woman's name, stepped closer to the child instead of retreating. Her weathered hands trembled visibly, but her eyes remained fixed on the boy's face with terrible certainty. She had served the royal family for over 4 decades, had witnessed the birth of the king himself, had memorized every line and shadow of the royal visage. Recognition wasn't merely intuition, it was knowledge carved into her very soul. "Madness," scoffed the merchant who had first pushed the boy. His face had reddened to a dangerous shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging beneath layers of fat. The old woman's mind has finally rotted away completely. Several nobles laughed nervously in agreement, the sound brittle and forced. They glanced toward the high table, gauging the king's reaction. Their loyalty balanced precariously between truth and what would please their monarch. The guard captain tightened his grip on the boy's shoulder, fingers digging painfully into the thin flesh. "Continue with the removal," he ordered his men, voice deliberately loud enough to drown out further proclamations from the old lady. He pushed the boy roughly toward the exit, nearly lifting him off his bare feet. Lady Elspeth moved with surprising speed for her age, placing herself between the guards and the door. "Stop this at once," she commanded, drawing herself up to her full height, still barely reaching the captain's chest. "Look at him properly, all of you." Her voice cracked with emotion. "Look at his brow, the set of his jaw. Are you all blind to what stands before you?" The captain hesitated, caught between duty and superstition. No one dismissed Lady Elspeth lightly. She had been the king's own nursemaid, and rumors persisted that she possessed the second sight. To ignore her might be folly, yet to acknowledge her claim would spark dangerous questions. His indecision manifested as a painful grip that made the boy wince. The whispers grew throughout the hall, spreading like wildfire from table to table. Some laughed at the absurd spectacle, enjoying the unexpected entertainment. Others watched with calculating eyes, minds racing to determine how this strange turn of events might benefit or harm their standing in court. A small handful observed with genuine concern for the frightened child caught in a storm he couldn't possibly comprehend. "A royal bastard?" someone whispered too loudly. "Impossible. Look at those rags. The old woman's gone mad." "But the resemblance." The boy's heart hammered against his ribs with such force he feared it might break through. His thoughts scattered like startled birds, unable to make sense of what was happening. Why were they looking at him like that? What did the old woman mean about his eyes? He knew nothing of kings or courts. His world had been limited to the hardscrabble village at the edge of the forest, to daily struggles for food and warmth, to the bitter memory of his mother's death last winter and the nameless grave where they'd laid her. The merchant, unwilling to let the interruption stand, moved toward Lady Elspeth with menace in his small eyes. "Step aside, you senile fool. This filthy urchin has no place here among decent folk." His pudgy hand reached for her arm, intending to move her forcibly if necessary. "Touch me, Master Fletcher, and you'll find your lucrative silk contracts with the crown mysteriously cancelled by month's end." Her voice was soft but carried the unmistakable ring of truth. The merchant's hand froze midair, then withdrew as if burned. Lady Elspeth turned her attention to the captain. "Release the boy. Now." The captain's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly to his men. They released their grip reluctantly, leaving red marks on the boy's arms that would surely bruise by morning. The child stood uncertainly, swaying slightly on his feet, torn between the instinct to flee and a strange, inexplicable feeling that he should remain, that something momentous hung in the balance. From the high table, the king finally rose. His movement, though unhurried, commanded instant attention. The hall fell silent once more as he descended the 3 steps from the dais with deliberate grace, his crimson and gold robes flowing around him like liquid fire in the candlelight. He moved through the parting crowd, his face an unreadable mask that had been perfected through years of court politics. The boy watched the king's approach with wide eyes. There was something mesmerizing about this man who wore power as naturally as others wore clothing. Even in his terror and confusion, the child couldn't help but notice how everyone else shrank in the king's presence, how the very air seemed to bend around him as if acknowledging his authority. The king stopped several paces away, studying the boy with piercing intensity. His eyes, a distinctive shade of amber flecked with gold, moved methodically over the child's features. Those same eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly when they reached the boy's matching amber gaze. "Your Majesty," the merchant began obsequiously, bowing so low his multiple chins folded into each other. "Forgive this unfortunate disruption to your celebration. This beggar boy somehow slipped past the guards." The king silenced him with nothing more than a slight tilt of his head. "I do not recall asking for your assessment, Master Fletcher." The words were soft, but carried such authority that the merchant visibly shrank, backing away with mumbled apologies. Lady Elspeth curtsied deeply despite her arthritic knees. "Your Majesty, I spoke out of turn and accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate. But I could not stay silent when confronted with what my eyes clearly see." The king regarded her for a long moment. "And what exactly do your eyes see, Lady Elspeth, that has caused such commotion in my hall?" His tone revealed nothing of his thoughts. The boy stood transfixed, his gaze darting between the king and the old woman. A strange sensation swept through him, an inexplicable feeling of recognition that made no logical sense. He had never seen this man before today, yet something about him felt familiar, like a half-remembered dream or a melody heard in early childhood. "I see a child with the royal blood of your line, sire," Lady Elspeth replied, her voice steady despite the audacity of her claim. "The resemblance cannot be coincidental." The king's expression remained carefully neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes, something that might have been memory or pain, or both intertwined. He turned his full attention to the boy, who fought the urge to look away from such intense scrutiny. "What is your name, child?" the king asked, his deep voice surprisingly gentle. The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry with fear. I don't really have one, Your Majesty." The formal address felt strange on his tongue, but he had heard others use it. "In the village, they just call me Beggar Boy, or sometimes Nobody." He hadn't meant for the words to sound pitiful, but a ripple of uncomfortable murmurs spread through the watching crowd. Something passed across the king's face then, a fleeting expression of genuine emotion before the mask slipped back into place. He turned to the captain of the guard. "Take the boy to the East Wing guest chambers. See that he is bathed, clothed, and fed." His tone made it clear these instructions were not to be questioned. "Your Majesty?" The captain's confusion was evident. "The East Wing? Those are royal quarters. Did I stutter, Captain?" The king's voice had an edge sharp enough to draw blood. The captain bowed deeply. "No, Your Majesty. It will be done immediately." As the guards moved to escort rather than expel the boy, the hall erupted in shocked whispers. The king returned to his seat at the high table, signaling for the music to resume as if nothing unusual had occurred. But his eyes remained fixed on the child until he disappeared through the side door. The boy, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of his fortune, allowed himself to be led away. As he passed Lady Elspeth, she leaned close enough that only he could hear her whispered words. "You have no idea who you really are." The king's eyes lingered on the empty doorway long after the boy had disappeared from sight. His fingers, adorned with the heavy royal signet ring, tapped in irregular rhythm against the polished oak of his throne, the only outward sign of the storm brewing within him. The nobles had resumed their revelry, though with a different energy now. Conversations more hushed, glances more furtive, speculation spreading like a fever through the gathering. None dared approach the throne directly, but their attention remained fixed on their monarch, watching for any clue to his thoughts. The king finally drew a deep breath and reached for his goblet. The rich burgundy wine trembled slightly as he lifted it to his lips. A tremor so slight only the most observant would notice. Behind the calculated mask of royal composure, memories assaulted him with merciless clarity. A face from the past, beautiful, defiant, ultimately doomed, swam before his mind's eye. A decision made in haste and regretted in private for years afterward. A sacrifice demanded by duty that his heart had never truly accepted. Those eyes. The boy had her mouth, her delicate nose, but those eyes were unmistakably his own, passed down through 7 generations of his bloodline. Eyes that marked the royal house as surely as the crown itself. In the East Wing, servants scrambled to prepare chambers that had stood empty for months. The boy found himself surrounded by a flurry of activity that made his head spin. A copper tub was dragged in and filled with steaming water scented with oils he couldn't name. Clothing appeared, simple but finely made, nothing like the rags he'd worn since his mother's death. Food arrived on silver trays, bread still warm from the ovens, roasted meat glistening with juices, fruits he'd only ever glimpsed in merchants' carts. "Arms up," commanded an efficient maidservant, tugging at his tattered shirt without ceremony. The boy instinctively crossed his arms over his chest. "I can wash myself," he protested, his cheeks burning with shame at the thought of these strangers seeing his body. Bony ribs visible beneath grimy skin, scars from years of hard living mapped across his back. The servants exchanged glances, uncertain how to proceed. The captain of the guard, who had remained to ensure the king's orders were followed, frowned impatiently. "The boy will have privacy," came a firm voice from the doorway. Lady Elspeth stood there, her age-spotted hands clasped before her. "Everyone out. I will attend to him." The servants hesitated only briefly before complying, recognizing her authority despite her diminished station. The captain lingered longest, suspicion evident in his narrowed eyes. The king ordered him bathed and fed, not gawked at like a curiosity in a traveling show," Lady Elspeth interrupted. "I've bathed royalty since before you were born, Captain." "I believe I can manage one small boy." Once the room had emptied, Lady Elspeth closed the door and turned to the child. Her stern expression softened as she took in his frightened stance and wary eyes. "No one will hurt you here," she said gently. The boy regarded her with undisguised skepticism. Experience had taught him that kindness from strangers usually came with hidden costs. "Why are you helping me?" Lady Elspeth approached slowly and knelt with some difficulty to meet his eyes directly. "Because I've carried a heavy secret for too long," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I failed someone once, and perhaps this is my chance to make amends." She reached out cautiously and brushed a lock of matted hair from his forehead. The boy flinched at first, then went still, surprised by how comforting the simple touch felt. How long had it been since anyone had touched him with gentleness? "You have your mother's spirit," she murmured, almost to herself. The boy's heart leapt. "You knew my mother?" Lady Elspeth's eyes widened slightly, then clouded with what might have been sadness. "Let's get you cleaned up first," she said, sidestepping his question. "Then we'll talk while you eat." Later, scrubbed clean and dressed in clothes that felt impossibly soft against his skin, the boy sat before a feast that would have fed his entire village. He ate cautiously at first, then with increasing abandon as his body demanded he make up for months of near starvation. Lady Elspeth watched with a mixture of amusement and sorrow. "Slowly," she advised. "Your stomach has shrunk. Too much at once will make you ill." The boy forced himself to pause, taking a deep breath. The chamber they'd given him was larger than any building he'd ever lived in, with tapestries depicting hunting scenes and battles, a bed piled with furs, and candles made of beeswax instead of tallow. Everything smelled clean and rich, overwhelming his senses. "What did you mean about my mother?" he asked, returning to the question that burned in his mind. "Did you know her?" Lady Elspeth sighed, her gaze drifting to the window where night pressed against the leaded glass. "I knew a woman once," she said carefully, "who loved unwisely and paid dearly for it." She looked back at him, studying his features with a gaze that seemed to see through him. "What do you remember of her?" The boy clutched his cup tightly. "She was beautiful," he said softly. "She sang while she worked. She would tell me stories at night about brave knights and far-off places." His throat tightened. "She got sick last winter. We had no money for medicine. She made me promise to be brave, and then—" He couldn't continue. Lady Elspeth's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "And your father?" "Never knew him," the boy replied, his voice hardening slightly. "Mother said he was a good man who had to go away. I stopped believing that years ago." The old woman's face revealed nothing, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured him more water. "And what if," she said carefully, "what if your father didn't know about you? What if he was told something very different from the truth?" The boy frowned. "What are you saying?" Before she could answer, the door opened. The king entered without announcement, his tall figure silhouetted against the torchlight from the corridor. Lady Elspeth rose immediately and curtsied. Though the boy noticed, she seemed less intimidated than the other servants had been. "Leave us," the king commanded, his voice resonant in the stone chamber. Lady Elspeth hesitated, glancing at the boy with concern. "Your Majesty, the child has been through much today. Perhaps tomorrow would be better for—" "Now, Elspeth." Though not raised, his tone brooked no argument. She curtsied again. "As you wish, sire." As she passed the boy, she squeezed his shoulder briefly, a small gesture of reassurance before she departed. Alone with the king, the boy felt his mouth go dry with apprehension. Should he stand? Bow? No one had taught him the proper protocol for facing royalty. He settled for sliding off his chair and standing awkwardly beside the table, eyes downcast. The king moved further into the room, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. He stopped at the window, staring out into the darkness, his profile sharp against the night sky. "Come here, boy," he said finally. The child approached cautiously, stopping several paces away. Up close, the king seemed both more human and more intimidating, the lines around his eyes speaking of weariness, while the set of his jaw revealed unyielding strength. "Look at me," the king commanded softly. The boy raised his eyes reluctantly, meeting the monarch's gaze directly for the first time. The same amber eyes, flecked with gold, stared back at him, a mirror reflecting across a gulf of years and station. Something shifted in the king's expression, a subtle softening around the mouth, a barely perceptible widening of the eyes. His hand moved slightly, as if he might reach out, but then clenched into a fist at his side. "How old are you?" the king asked, his voice carefully controlled. 10 winters, I think, Your Majesty." Mother wasn't certain. The king closed his eyes briefly, performing some internal calculation. When they opened again, they contained a shadow of pain quickly masked. "And your mother? What was her name?" "Eleanor," the boy replied. "Eleanor of Millbrook Village." The king turned away sharply, his shoulders rigid beneath his royal robes. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions. "Your Majesty," the boy ventured, finding courage from some unknown reserve. "Why am I here? What does Lady Elspeth see when she looks at me? Why do you—" He swallowed hard. "Why do you look at me like that?" The king's breathing changed, becoming more deliberate, as if he were bracing himself. Slowly, he turned back to face the child. For a brief, startling moment, the mask of royalty fell away completely, revealing a man torn by regret and something that might have been hope. "I look at you," he said with quiet intensity, "and see a ghost I thought long buried. I see a truth that could upend a kingdom. I see—" His voice faltered slightly. "I see eyes that I've only ever seen in my own reflection and in the faces of my bloodline." The boy's heart pounded so loudly he was certain the king must hear it. A strange feeling swept through him. Not fear now, but a dawning realization so enormous his mind could barely contain it. The king straightened, his royal bearing returning like armor being donned. "We will speak more tomorrow. Rest now, you are safe here." As the king turned to leave, the boy found his voice again. The question burst from him, raw and desperate. "Are you my father?" The king froze, his hand on the door latch. The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity, laden with the weight of secrets long kept. When the king finally spoke, his voice was barely audible, meant perhaps only for himself. "I don't know what I am to you, child. That is what terrifies me." The king's footsteps faded down the corridor, leaving the boy alone with a maelstrom of thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him. His legs trembled beneath him until they could no longer support his weight, and he sank onto the edge of the ornate bed, fingers digging into the impossibly soft mattress. The question he had asked, "Are you my father?" seemed to echo in the empty chamber, unanswered yet hanging in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Sleep came in fitful bursts that night, dreams tangling with reality until the boy could no longer distinguish between them. He dreamed of his mother's gentle hands, of her singing while she mended their clothes by candlelight, of her whispered stories about noble knights and kind princes, stories that had seemed so fantastical then, but now took on new, unsettling meaning. Had she been telling him fragments of truth all along, disguised as bedtime tales? Morning arrived with thin beams of sunlight streaming through the leaded glass windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in golden shafts. For a disorienting moment, the boy expected to wake on his straw pallet in the village, the familiar sounds of livestock and early rising neighbors filtering through the thin walls of his home. Instead, he found himself nestled in furs and linens finer than anything he'd ever touched, in a room larger than entire cottages. A soft knock at the door startled him fully awake. Lady Elspeth entered, carrying a tray laden with bread, honey, fresh milk, and early autumn apples. Her shrewd eyes took in his rumpled appearance, the dark circles beneath his eyes testifying to his restless night. "You didn't sleep well," she observed, setting the tray on a small table by the window. It wasn't a question. The boy slid from the bed, suddenly conscious of his fine new clothes, now wrinkled from being slept in, and his bare feet against the cold stone floor. "I couldn't stop thinking," he admitted. Lady Elspeth nodded as if she'd expected this answer. "Eat," she encouraged, gesturing to the food. "We have much to discuss, and you'll need your strength." As the boy ate, more slowly now than in his hunger-driven frenzy of the previous night, Lady Elspeth drew back the heavy curtains fully, allowing sunshine to flood the chamber. Beyond the window lay a view of the castle gardens, where servant girls were already harvesting late-season vegetables and herbs, their woven baskets gradually filling with the bounty. "The king has summoned his closest advisors to a private council," Lady Elspeth said finally, turning from the window. "Word of your presence has spread through the castle like wildfire. By nightfall, the entire kingdom will be buzzing with rumors." The boy swallowed a mouthful of honeyed bread. "What kind of rumors?" The old woman's face grew somber. "That depends on who's doing the whispering. Some will claim you're a pretender, a clever beggar boy taught to mimic royal mannerisms to perpetrate some elaborate scheme. Others will insist you're exactly what you appear to be, a child of royal blood who has lived in obscurity until now." "And which is true?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lady Elspeth studied him for a long moment before answering. "Truth is rarely simple in places of power, child. But I will tell you what I know." She settled into a chair beside him, her aging joints creaking slightly. 11 years ago, the king loved a woman he could not marry. She was beautiful, kind, and fiercely intelligent. But she was a commoner, the daughter of a village healer. Their love was forbidden by ancient laws that demand royal marriages, serve political alliances, not matters of the heart. The boy's breath caught in his throat. "My mother was a healer," he said. "She knew which herbs could cure fevers and which roots would ease pain." A sad smile touched Lady Elspeth's lips. "Yes, Eleanor of Millbrook. I remember her well. She served briefly in the castle as a lady's maid, though her knowledge of medicine was what truly distinguished her. The king met her when she treated his hunting wound, a seemingly chance encounter that altered many destinies." Outside in the corridor, voices rose suddenly, angry, insistent, before being hushed by someone with apparent authority. The tension from the great hall had spread throughout the castle like contagion. "What happened to them?" the boy pressed, setting aside his half-eaten breakfast. "They loved in secret for nearly a year. When Eleanor discovered she was with child, with you, she went to the king in joy, expecting he would find some way for them to be together." Lady Elspeth's eyes grew distant with memory. "But that same week, the neighboring kingdom of Aldermere had begun amassing troops at our borders. The threat of war loomed. The royal council insisted the king secure an alliance through marriage to Princess Marguerite of Eastlock immediately, or risk the realm being plunged into bloody conflict." The boy's hands curled into fists in his lap. "So he abandoned her. Abandoned us." "No," Lady Elspeth said sharply. "Not exactly. The king arranged for Eleanor to be given a cottage in Millbrook village, with enough gold to live comfortably for years. He planned to acknowledge you once political tensions eased." Her voice dropped lower. "But the Grand Chancellor, Lord Harwick, saw your existence as a threat to the stability of the realm. Without the king's knowledge, he told Eleanor that the king had rejected both her and the unborn child, that he questioned the child's paternity and wanted nothing more to do with either of you." "That's a lie," the boy exclaimed, then immediately covered his mouth, shocked at his own outburst. Lady Elspeth nodded grimly. Indeed it was, but Eleanor believed it. Heartbroken, she refused the cottage and the gold, taking only enough to reach Millbrook village on her own. She disappeared, and the king was told she had accepted his arrangement. By the time I discovered Lord Harwick's deception, it was too late. Eleanor could not be found, and the king had already married Princess Marguerite. The grand doors of the chamber burst open suddenly, startling them both. A cluster of richly dressed men entered, members of the royal council, their faces set in varying expressions of consternation, suspicion, and calculation. At their center strode the heavy-set merchant from the previous night's feast, his jowls quivering with barely contained outrage. "This is preposterous," he bellowed, pointing an accusing finger at the boy. "This gutter rat appears and suddenly we're entertaining the notion that he might be of royal blood. I demand proof before this charade continues any further." Lady Elspeth rose to her feet with surprising dignity. "Mind your tone, Master Fletcher. You speak in the presence of what? A beggar boy with a passing resemblance to our king? Half the brown-haired, light-eyed boys in the kingdom could make the same claim." The merchant's face had purpled with indignation. "This is clearly some plot to undermine the legitimate succession. Princess Marguerite will bear a true heir any day now. The timing of this impostor's appearance is far too convenient to be coincidence." Other voices joined in, the chamber filling with a cacophony of accusations and counter-arguments. "The resemblance is uncanny. A clever fraud, nothing more. We must consider the possibility. The stability of the realm is at stake." The boy shrank back in his chair, overwhelmed by the sudden onslaught. These powerful men spoke about him as if he weren't present, debating his existence as they might discuss a disputed land claim or trade agreement. His throat constricted with a mixture of fear and growing anger. Had anyone asked what he wanted in all this? The merchant advanced toward him, looming over his chair. "Tell us, boy, who put you up to this? Who coached you to infiltrate the castle?" His meaty hand shot out, grabbing the boy's chin and forcing his face upward. "Confess your scheme now, and perhaps the king will show mercy instead of having you flogged for your deception." Something snapped inside the boy then. A lifetime of being pushed aside, ignored, dismissed as worthless simply because of his poverty. He jerked away from the merchant's grip and stood, drawing himself up to his full height. Still small, still thin, but suddenly radiating a dignity that stopped the arguing counselors mid-sentence. "I didn't ask to come here," he said, his voice clear and steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. "I didn't ask to be noticed or recognized. I just wanted food, that's all. I don't care about crowns or kingdoms or who my father might be." His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. "All I've ever wanted was to not be hungry, to not be cold, to not be alone." The chamber fell silent. Even the merchant took a half-step back, momentarily disarmed by the raw honesty in the child's words. Into this silence came the sound of slow, deliberate applause. All heads turned toward the doorway where the king stood, his face an inscrutable mask. How long he had been there, listening, none could say. "Well spoken, child," the king said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the chamber. "Perhaps there are men present who could learn something of dignity from a boy raised in poverty." His gaze swept over the counselors, lingering pointedly on the merchant's flushed face. The king stepped fully into the room, and the atmosphere shifted immediately. Backs straightened, voices hushed, eyes lowered in deference. Even in simple morning attire, without crown or scepter, his authority was absolute. "The council will reconvene in 1 hour," he commanded. "Until then, I will speak with the boy alone. All of you, out." No one dared protest. Even Lady Elspeth curtsied and withdrew, though not before giving the boy a reassuring glance. Within moments, the chamber had emptied, leaving only the king and the child who might be his son. The silence between them stretched taut as a bowstring. The door closed with a soft but definitive thud, sealing the king and boy within a pocket of silence that seemed to pulse with unspoken questions. Outside, the hurried footsteps of departing counselors faded down the corridor, leaving only the muffled sounds of distant castle life filtering through the thick stone walls. The king moved to the window, his silhouette framed against the morning light, hands clasped behind his back in what the boy recognized as a practiced pose, one designed to project authority while concealing inner turmoil. "You slept in your clothes," the king observed without turning. The boy glanced down at his rumpled attire, heat rising to his cheeks. "I'm not used to night clothes," he admitted, "or beds this soft." The king nodded slightly. "When I was your age, I escaped my chambers during a thunderstorm and slept in the stables. The royal bed felt too much like drowning in feathers." A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he turned. "My father had the entire castle searched before they found me curled up with my favorite hunting dog." This unexpected glimpse of the king as a child, as someone who had once been small and uncertain, momentarily bridged the vast gulf between them. The boy relaxed his tightly clenched hands, feeling some of the tension drain from his shoulders. "I never had a dog," he offered cautiously, "but there was a three-legged cat that sometimes slept near our hearth in winter." The king's eyes, those unsettlingly familiar amber eyes, softened briefly. He crossed the room and settled into the chair Lady Elspeth had vacated, bringing himself to the boy's level rather than towering over him. The gesture seemed deliberate, an attempt to create something approaching equality in a situation where none could truly exist. "You spoke well just now," the king said. "Few men twice your age would have shown such composure when confronted by the royal council." The boy's fingers traced the intricate pattern woven into the chair's upholstery. "I've faced worse than angry men in fine clothes." "Yes," the king acknowledged quietly. "I imagine you have." A heartbeat of silence passed between them. "Lady Elspeth told me about my mother," the boy said finally, raising his eyes to meet the king's gaze directly. "She told me you loved her." The king's face remained carefully composed, but something flickered behind his eyes. A flash of old pain swiftly contained. "Lady Elspeth speaks too freely," he said, his tone measured. "But yes, I loved your mother. Eleanor was—" He paused, searching for words. "She was unlike anyone I had ever known. Fearless in her convictions, gentle in her healing, fierce in her love. She never told me who my father was," the boy said. "Only that he was a good man who had to go away." The king's hand tightened on the armrest, knuckles whitening briefly before he consciously relaxed his grip. "She showed more kindness than I deserved," he said, almost to himself. The boy studied the king's face, the strong jaw now slightly softened with age, the lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow, the streaks of silver at his temples that hadn't been visible beneath the crown. He searched for reflections of himself in those features, for confirmation of what everyone seemed to believe. "I never wanted to be a prince," the boy said suddenly. "I just wanted enough food, a warm place to sleep." His voice dropped lower. "I wanted my mother not to die because we couldn't afford medicine." The naked accusation hung in the air between them. The king did not flinch from it. "If I had known where you were, if I had known about Lord Harwick's deception, things would have been different," the king said. His voice remained steady, but a muscle jumped in his jaw. "I have committed many sins in my life, but I would never have abandoned my own child to poverty and suffering. Never." "But you didn't look for us," the boy countered, a lifetime of hardship giving edge to his words. "You became king. You married your princess. You forgot." For the first time, the king's composed expression cracked. Pain flashed naked across his features before he could master it. "I never forgot," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not for one day, not for 1 hour." He leaned forward, eyes boring into the boy's. "I had men searching for years. When they finally reported that Eleanor had died of fever in a remote village, I mourned her as deeply as if she had been my queen, but they never mentioned a child." The boy's heart hammered in his chest. Could this be true? Had his mother hidden them so thoroughly that even the king's men couldn't find them? Or was this another royal deception? "How do I know you're telling the truth?" he asked, surprising himself with his boldness. The king did not take offense. Instead, he reached inside his tunic and withdrew a small object suspended on a fine gold chain. He held it in his palm, offering it for the boy to see. It was a locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful, engraved with intricate vines and flowers. "Your mother gave me this before we parted," the king said softly. "Open it." With trembling fingers, the boy took the locket and carefully pried it open. Inside was a tiny portrait, no larger than a thumbnail, exquisitely painted. A young woman with chestnut hair and laughing eyes. His breath caught. Though the colors were more vivid than his fading memories, there was no mistaking that face. "Mother," he whispered, tracing the miniature portrait with the tip of his finger. "I have carried her next to my heart every day since she disappeared," the king said. "Even after I believed her dead, even after my marriage, even knowing the risk if it were discovered. The boy closed the locket gently and handed it back, watching as the king returned it to its hiding place beneath his tunic. The gesture held a ritual quality, as if the king were tucking away not just a treasured object, but a piece of his heart. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Without waiting for a response, a servant entered, his expression harried. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but the nobles are gathering in the great hall." "There are complications." The king's expression hardened instantly, the vulnerable man disappearing behind the royal mask. "What complications?" "Lord Harwick has arrived with Princess Marguerite. They are demanding an immediate audience regarding the boy." The servant's eyes flickered nervously to the child. The king rose, once again the imposing figure of authority. "Tell them I will attend shortly." The servant bowed and retreated. When the door closed, the king turned back to the boy. "I must deal with this," he said. "You will remain here for your safety. Guards will be posted outside your door, not to imprison you, but to protect you. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, though in truth, he understood very little of the storm swirling around him. His world had been upended in less than a day, transforming from desperate hunger to potential princehood with dizzying speed. The king moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "I cannot undo the past," he said, his voice low and intense. "I cannot give you back the years we lost. But I swear on my crown and kingdom that from this day forward, you will never again know hunger or cold or abandonment. Whatever happens, whatever truths are revealed, you have my protection and my—" He hesitated, as if the word caught in his throat. "My care." It wasn't quite a declaration of fatherhood, the boy noted, but it was something, a promise, a beginning. As the king reached for the door handle, the boy found his voice again. "What will happen now?" The king's shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly, as if he were donning invisible armor. "Now," he said, "I face the consequences of choices made long ago. Some truths can be buried for years, but once unearthed, they demand to be acknowledged, no matter how uncomfortable or inconvenient they may be for those in power." He opened the door, and the boy caught a glimpse of armed guards taking position in the corridor. Just before the king stepped through, the boy called out again, "What's your name?" The question sounded childish even to his own ears, but somehow it seemed important. To know the king as something more than a title, more than a crown. The king paused, looking back with an expression the boy couldn't quite decipher. "Edmund," he said finally. "My name is Edmund." With that, he was gone, and the heavy oak door closed behind him, leaving the boy alone with his thoughts and the lingering scent of beeswax candles. He moved to the window and gazed out at the castle grounds, watching servants scurry between buildings, guards patrol the walls, and nobles arrive on horseback, drawn by the spreading rumors. Somewhere in those grounds walked a monk, Lady Elspeth had said, a man with mysterious words and knowing eyes. Somewhere in the great hall, a confrontation brewed that would determine the boy's fate. And somewhere in this vast, unfamiliar world of stone and privilege, there might be a place for a former beggar who had never imagined his life could change so completely in the space of a single night. The boy remained at the window long after the king, Edmund, had departed, watching the castle grounds with newfound curiosity. Everything seemed different now, as if the revelation of his possible heritage had transformed not just his circumstances but his very perception of the world. The guards stationed outside his door were both protection and prison, the luxurious chamber both sanctuary and cage. He observed servants hurrying with purpose across the courtyard, carrying trays laden with food and pitchers of wine toward the great hall. Something significant was happening, and he was its unwitting catalyst. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The door opened to reveal Lady Elspeth, her expression tight with concern. She slipped inside and closed the door quickly behind her. "The castle is in chaos," she said without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lord Harwick has arrived with the princess, and he's demanding your immediate removal. He claims you're part of a plot to destabilize the succession." The boy turned from the window. "Who is Lord Harwick? You mentioned him before. You said he lied to my mother." Lady Elspeth's mouth thinned into a grim line. The Grand Chancellor, a man who has spent 30 years accruing power by whispering in the ears of kings, he orchestrated the marriage between King Edmund and Princess Marguerite, securing the alliance with Eastlock and preventing war. She moved closer, lowering her voice further. But his loyalty is not to Edmund. It's to the crown itself, to what he calls the continuity of power. He would sacrifice anyone, even a child, to maintain what he considers stability. And the princess? The boy asked, remembering the servant's words. Marguerite of Eastlock. Lady Elspeth sighed, easing herself onto a chair as her aged joints protested. Beautiful, shrewd, and raised from birth to be a queen. For 10 years she has endured a marriage without love, given everything to her role except the one thing the kingdom demands, an heir. Until now. The boy's eyes widened. She's with child? 7 months along. After years of disappointment, the court physicians finally confirmed it last spring. The kingdom rejoiced. Lady Elspeth's weathered hands twisted in her lap. And then you appeared. A living reminder of the king's love for another woman, a potential threat to her unborn child's claim to the throne. The implication hung heavy in the air. The boy felt a cold knot form in his stomach. She would see me as an enemy. She would see you dead if she could, Lady Elspeth corrected bluntly, or at least banished so far from court that you'd never be seen or heard from again. But it's Harwick who concerns me more. He has the resources and the ruthlessness to ensure you disappear permanently. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air crept up the boy's spine. Yesterday, he had been nobody, a hungry child hoping for scraps. Today, he was important enough that powerful people wished him harm. The thought was terrifying. I never asked for any of this, he said softly. I could leave, go back to the village, pretend none of this ever happened. Lady Elspeth regarded him with something between sympathy and frustration. It's far too late for that. Knowledge once revealed cannot be buried again. Besides, her voice gentled, your mother would want you to claim your birthright. My birthright? The boy let out a bitter laugh. I don't even know if the king truly believes I'm his son. He believes, Lady Elspeth said with certainty. I've known Edmund since he was in swaddling clothes. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you, with recognition, with fear, with hope. She leaned forward. But believing and acknowledging publicly are different matters. The king must consider the kingdom's stability, the alliance with Eastlock, the loyalty of his nobles. The boy turned back to the window, pressing his palm against the cool glass. Beyond the castle walls lay fields and forests, villages like the one he'd come from, places where people lived and died without ever concerning themselves with royal succession or political alliances. For a moment, he longed to be among them again, anonymous and uncomplicated. What happens now? He asked, echoing his earlier question to the king. Lady Elspeth rose with some difficulty. Now I must return to the Great Hall before my absence is noted. The king has called an emergency council meeting, ostensibly to discuss harvest preparations, but everyone knows the true purpose. She moved to the door, then hesitated. There's something else you should know. The old monk you encountered in the garden, Brother Thomas, has requested to speak with you. The boy's head snapped up. The one who said my life was marked by destiny? Lady Elspeth nodded. He rarely leaves his hermitage in the western woods, yet he arrived at dawn today, as if he knew you would be here. Her expression grew troubled. Some say he has the gift of foresight. Others claim he's merely a madman with occasional moments of clarity. Either way, the king has granted his request. He'll be brought to you after the council meeting concludes. As she reached for the door handle, the boy called out, "Wait!" When she turned, he asked the question that had been burning in his mind since their earlier conversation. If the king truly loved my mother, why didn't he fight for her? Why didn't he change the laws so they could marry? Lady Elspeth's face softened with old sorrow. Because 10 years ago, our kingdom stood on the brink of war. Thousands would have died if the alliance with Eastlock failed. Edmund made the choice that kings must sometimes make, sacrificing personal happiness for the greater good. She sighed deeply. Whether it was the right choice is not for me to say, but it has haunted him every day since. After she departed, the boy was left alone with his thoughts once more. He wandered the chamber restlessly, running his fingers over tapestries depicting heroic battles and royal hunts, testing the softness of the bed furs, examining the craftsmanship of the carved furniture. Everything spoke of wealth and permanence, a stark contrast to the precarious existence he'd known all his life. His reflection caught him by surprise as he passed a polished silver mirror hanging near the wardrobe. The face that stared back was both familiar and strange. The grime of poverty had been washed away, revealing features he'd never properly seen before. His cheekbones, the set of his jaw, the shape of his brow, he studied them with new interest, searching for traces of the king in his own face. The hours passed slowly. Servants brought food that he barely touched, his appetite diminished by anxiety. Guards changed shifts outside his door, their murmured conversations too low to overhear. The sunlight shifted across the floor as morning gave way to afternoon. Finally, as shadows began to lengthen, the door opened without a preliminary knock. A stooped figure in a rough brown robe entered, the monk from the garden. Up close he appeared even more ancient than the boy had first thought, his face a network of deep lines and his white beard reaching nearly to his waist. Yet his eyes were clear and sharp, missing nothing as they took in the boy's appearance. "So," Brother Thomas said, his voice surprisingly strong for one so old, "the lost prince returns at last." He closed the door behind him and moved further into the chamber with slow but deliberate steps. "I'm not a prince," the boy protested automatically. Brother Thomas merely smiled, the expression causing his face to crease in new and intriguing patterns. "Are you not? Then what are you?" The simple question left the boy momentarily speechless. Yesterday he would have answered a beggar or perhaps an orphan. Today he had no answer at all. "You stand at a crossroads," the monk continued, lowering himself onto a chair without waiting for invitation. "Your next choices will echo through years to come, affecting not just your fate, but the fate of this kingdom." The boy felt a flicker of irritation pierce through his confusion. "Everyone speaks to me of fate and choices, but I have no power here. I'm just a pawn in someone else's game." "Is that what you believe?" Brother Thomas asked, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "That you have no power? Then you understand nothing of true power." He leaned forward, his eyes suddenly intense. "Kings rule by force of arms and ancient laws, yes. But there is a power in truth that can topple thrones and remake kingdoms. You carry that power within you, whether you choose to wield it or not." A chill ran through the boy at the monk's words. "What truth do I carry?" "That is for you to discover," Brother Thomas replied cryptically. "But know this, the path ahead will not be easy. There are those who would silence you, use you, or destroy you to protect their own interests. You must be as wise as a serpent and as innocent as a dove." The boy's frustration mounted. "More riddles. Can't anyone simply tell me what I should do?" Brother Thomas's smile returned, gentler now. "If I told you what to do, I would be no different from those who seek to control you. True power comes from making your own choices, even in the face of overwhelming forces." He rose slowly to his feet. "Remember this, royal blood flows in your veins, but your strength comes not from your bloodline, but from your mother's love and from the hardships you have endured." The monk moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "When the moment comes, and it will come soon, speak from your heart, not from fear or anger or ambition. That is all the guidance I can give you." "Wait," the boy called as Brother Thomas reached for the door. "How did you know I would be here? Lady Elspeth said you arrived at dawn, but I was only discovered last night." The old man's eyes twinkled mysteriously. "I have waited for your arrival for many years, child." The signs were clear for those with eyes to see them. With those enigmatic words, he slipped out, leaving the boy with even more questions than before. Barely a moment later, the door burst open again. This time it was a royal guard, his expression urgent. "You're to come with me immediately," he announced. "By order of the king." "Where are we going?" the boy asked, heart suddenly pounding. "To the Great Hall," the guard replied grimly. "The council demands your presence. The king—" He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "The king is about to make a declaration about your identity. One way or another, your fate will be decided today." The boy's heart hammered against his ribs as the guard led him through a labyrinth of corridors. Each step carried him deeper into the heart of the castle and closer to whatever judgment awaited. Servants pressed themselves against the walls as they passed, their curious eyes following the strange procession. A royal guard in full regalia escorting a child dressed in simple but fine clothing. Neither servant nor noble, an anomaly in the carefully ordered world of court hierarchy. Their footsteps echoed against stone walls adorned with ancestral tapestries and mounted weapons of war. The boy tried to commit their route to memory, left at the statue of a mounted knight, down a spiral staircase, through an arched doorway emblazoned with the royal crest, but each new turn only added to his disorientation. If he needed to flee, he would be hopelessly lost within minutes. The thought sent a chill through him. Flee to where? His village home was gone, his mother dead, his former life impossible to reclaim now that he had stepped into this world of intrigue and power. Whatever awaited him in the great hall, there could be no turning back. As they approached massive double doors of dark oak banded with iron, the cacophony of voices grew louder, dozens of people arguing, their tones ranging from coldly reasonable to barely restrained fury. The guard paused, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Remember to bow when you enter," he instructed in a low voice. "Keep your eyes lowered until the king acknowledges you. Speak only when directly addressed." Something like sympathy flickered across the man's weathered face. "And remember, whatever happens in there, the king's word is final." The boy nodded, his mouth too dry for speech. The guard straightened, resuming his professional demeanor, and signaled to the doormen. With ceremonial precision, they swung open the massive doors. The great hall fell silent as the boy entered. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him, nobles in their finery, knights in polished armor, clergy in flowing robes, all arranged according to rank and importance. At the far end, seated on a raised dais beneath a canopy of crimson and gold, was King Edmund. His expression betrayed nothing as he watched the boy's approach. To the king's right stood a woman of breathtaking beauty, her golden hair elaborately coiffed and adorned with pearls, her gown of azure silk draped to elegantly accommodate the swell of advanced pregnancy. This could only be Princess Marguerite. Her porcelain features were arranged in a mask of serene dignity, but her eyes, cold as winter sky, followed the boy's every movement with undisguised hostility. Beside her stood an older man with a hawkish profile and thin lips pressed into a bloodless line. Despite his advanced years, he stood rigidly upright, his black and silver robes marking him as someone of significant rank. The boy didn't need to be told that this was Lord Harwick, the Grand Chancellor who had separated him from his birthright with calculated lies. The boy remembered to bow as instructed, keeping his eyes on the intricate mosaic floor beneath his feet. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the occasional cough or rustle of fabric as courtiers shifted uncomfortably. "Approach," the king finally commanded, his voice carrying effortlessly across the vast chamber. The boy moved forward on legs that threatened to buckle beneath him. The distance to the dais seemed endless, each step exposing him further to the collective scrutiny of the realm's most powerful figures. He stopped at the prescribed distance and waited, heart thundering in his ears. "Look at me, child," the king said, his tone softer now. The boy raised his eyes, meeting the king's gaze. For a fleeting moment, something passed between them, a silent communication that transcended the formality of the setting. Then the king's expression became impassive once more as he addressed the assembly. "My lords and ladies, esteemed counselors, honored guests, you have been summoned to witness a matter of grave importance to the realm." King Edmund's voice resonated with authority. "As you are aware, questions have arisen regarding this child's identity and his connection to the royal bloodline. I have consulted with my advisors, examined the evidence, and reached a conclusion that I will now share with you all." Lord Harwick stepped forward, his movement so slight it barely disturbed the air, yet somehow drawing all attention to himself. "If I may, Your Majesty, before you proceed," his voice was smooth as silk, yet carried an edge of steel. "The Council recommends caution in this delicate matter. premature declarations could have far-reaching consequences for the stability of the realm and our alliances with neighboring kingdoms. The princess laid a protective hand over her swollen belly, the gesture deliberately theatrical. "Indeed, husband," she added, her accent betraying her foreign origins. "One must consider the impact on the true heir to the throne." Her gaze flickered meaningfully to her unborn child. A murmur rippled through the assembly. The king's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I am well aware of the implications, Lord Harwick." The temperature of his voice dropped several degrees. "As for true heirs, Princess Marguerite, let us not presume what has yet to be established by fact." The princess's cheeks flushed with anger or humiliation, or both. Lord Harwick's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes narrowed fractionally. The king turned his attention back to the boy. "Tell me, child, do you know why you are here?" The question caught the boy off guard. He had expected declarations, not inquiries. He swallowed hard, acutely conscious of hundreds of ears straining to catch his response. Because Lady Elspeth said I have your eyes," he answered, his voice smaller than he would have liked. "Because people think I might be your son." Another ripple of whispers swept through the hall, louder this time. The king raised a hand, and silence fell instantly. "And what do you think?" he asked, leaning forward slightly in his throne. "Do you believe yourself to be my son?" The boy hesitated, Brother Thomas's words echoing in his memory. "Speak from your heart, not from fear or anger or ambition." He took a deep breath. "I don't know," he said honestly. "My mother never told me who my father was, only that he was a good man who had to leave. I never thought—" His voice wavered, then steadied. "I never thought he would be a king. I never thought I would matter enough for anyone to care about my bloodline." The naked truth of his words seemed to resonate throughout the hall. Even Lord Harwick appeared momentarily disarmed by the child's candor. The king's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Your name," the king said. "You told me you were called Beggar Boy or Nobody in the village. Did your mother ever call you by another name?" The boy blinked, surprised by the question. "She called me Thomas," he said, "after her father." At this simple statement, Lady Elspeth gasped audibly from where she stood among the court ladies. All eyes turned briefly toward her before shifting back to the king, whose complexion had paled noticeably. "Thomas," he repeated softly, almost to himself. Then louder. "When I knew your mother, she spoke often of her father, a healer of great skill who taught her everything she knew of medicine. She vowed that if she ever had a son, she would name him Thomas to honor his memory." His gaze intensified. "This is not a fact known to the court or to the public. It was a private conversation between Eleanor and myself." Lord Harwick stepped forward again, his composure slightly fractured. "Your Majesty, this proves nothing." The boy could have been coached. "By whom, Lord Harwick?" The king interrupted, his tone deceptively mild. "Who besides myself and Eleanor would know this detail, unless you were perhaps eavesdropping on our private moments?" The chancellor stiffened. "I merely suggest caution, sire. The succession has concerned you greatly over the years, has it not?" The king rose from his throne, descending the dais steps with deliberate slowness. "So much so that you took matters into your own hands a decade ago." Lord Harwick's face drained of color. "Your Majesty, I don't know what you—" "Lady Elspeth has made a full confession." The king cut in, coming to stand directly before the chancellor. Though they were of similar height, the king somehow seemed to tower over the older man. "She has admitted her role in concealing the truth from me all these years, and named you as the architect of the deception. You told Eleanor I had rejected her and her unborn child. You told me she had accepted my provision and disappeared of her own will. 2 lives destroyed by your lies. 3, counting the boy." The great hall had gone deathly quiet. Even Princess Marguerite appeared shocked, her perfect composure cracking as she glanced between her husband and the chancellor. Lord Harwick drew himself up, abandoning pretense. "Everything I have done has been for the good of the kingdom," he declared, his voice carrying throughout the hall. "A king cannot marry for love when alliances hang in the balance. The common girl had to go, and the child—" He broke off, perhaps realizing too late how his words would be received. The child had to be hidden away, the king finished for him, his voice dangerously soft. A royal son left to starve in a village while you counseled me on matters of state and arranged my marriage to secure your political ambitions. Princess Marguerite made a small, distressed sound. The king turned to her, his expression softening slightly. You were as much a pawn in his game as I was, Marguerite, he said. I have always respected you, even if our marriage lacked the love we both deserved. The princess's eyes filled with unshed tears, but she lifted her chin proudly. And what now, husband? Will you cast me aside for a ghost? Will my child compete with a beggar boy for the throne? The king shook his head. No. What's done is done. Our marriage stands, and our child will be heir to the throne. He turned back to the boy, to Thomas, who had watched this exchange with wide, disbelieving eyes. But this boy is also my son, and I will acknowledge him before all as royal blood. The boy felt the world shift beneath his feet. After years of being nobody, of hunger and hardship and loneliness, to hear these words spoken in this place, it was too enormous to comprehend. I don't want your crown, he blurted out, his voice cracking with emotion. I don't want your kingdom. I don't want to be a prince or a lord or anything grand. Tears spilled down his cheeks, surprising him with their sudden appearance. I just want to know my father. The words hung in the air, achingly sincere. Even the most cynical courtiers seemed moved by the raw emotion in the child's voice. The king stood motionless, the careful mask of royal composure completely fallen away to reveal the man beneath, conflicted, remorseful, and deeply moved. Then, in full view of the entire court, King Edmund did something unprecedented. He knelt before the boy, bringing himself eye-level with his son, and opened his arms in silent invitation. Time seemed to stop in the great hall. The king of the realm knelt on the cold stone floor, arms extended toward the boy who had entered his castle as a beggar only yesterday. The silence was absolute. Hundreds of courtiers, nobles, and guards holding their breath as if the slightest sound might shatter this unprecedented moment. Not in living memory had a king knelt before anyone, let alone a child dressed in borrowed finery. Thomas stood frozen, overwhelmed by the gesture and all it represented. The king, his father, waited with a vulnerability that stripped away all trappings of royalty, leaving only a man seeking reconciliation for years lost. Behind them, Princess Marguerite's face reflected shock mingled with something more complex, while Lord Harwick appeared as a man watching his carefully constructed world crumble beneath his feet. The boy took one hesitant step forward, then another. His legs trembled beneath him, not with fear now, but with the weight of emotion too great for his small frame to contain. When he finally reached the king, he didn't immediately step into the offered embrace. Instead, he studied the man's face at close range, the lines of worry etched around his eyes, the flecks of silver in his beard, the unmistakable amber of his irises that mirrored the boy's own. You really didn't know about me? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper, meant for the king's ears alone. Had I known, Edmund replied with equal quietness, nothing in heaven or earth could have kept me from finding you. I would have moved mountains and drained seas to bring you home where you belonged. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Thomas felt the last wall of resistance within him crumble. With a small, choked sob, he fell forward into his father's arms. The king's embrace enveloped him completely. Strong, secure. The embrace Thomas had dreamed of on countless cold nights when hunger gnawed at his belly and loneliness at his heart. He breathed in the unfamiliar scents of fine oils and clean linen, so different from the smoke and earth smells of his village life. Against his cheek he could feel the steady beating of his father's heart. A collective sigh rippled through the assembly, part relief and part emotion at witnessing such a naked display of feeling from their normally reserved monarch. Some of the ladies dabbed discreetly at their eyes with embroidered handkerchiefs. Even hardened knights shifted uncomfortably, moved despite themselves. When the king finally released Thomas, he kept one hand on the boy's shoulder as he rose to his full height, facing the court once more. His voice, when he spoke, carried a new resonance. the authority of the crown now tempered with something warmer and more human. "Let it be known throughout the kingdom that I acknowledge this child, Thomas of Millbrook, as my true-born son," he proclaimed. "While the laws of succession remain unchanged, my child with Princess Marguerite shall inherit the throne. Thomas shall henceforth be recognized as a prince of the royal blood, with all the privileges and responsibilities that entails." Lord Harwick stepped forward, a last desperate attempt to salvage his position. "Your Majesty, the political implications," the king interrupted coldly, "are no longer your concern, Lord Harwick. You are hereby stripped of your title as Grand Chancellor and will be confined to your estates pending a full investigation into your abuse of power. Guards!" 2 armored men immediately moved to flank the former chancellor, whose face had gone ashen. "This is outrageous," he spluttered. "Everything I did was for the stability of the realm." "Take him away," the king commanded, his tone brooking no further argument. As the guards led Lord Harwick from the hall, murmurs of surprise and speculation bubbled through the crowd. Few had ever witnessed such a dramatic fall from power, especially one so publicly executed. Princess Marguerite stepped down from the dais, her movements graceful despite her advanced pregnancy. She approached Thomas with an unreadable expression. The boy tensed, uncertain what to expect from this woman who had every reason to see him as a threat. She stopped before him, studying his face with piercing intensity. Then, to everyone's astonishment, she extended her hand. "It seems we are to be family, young Thomas," she said, her accent lending a musical quality to her words. "I cannot pretend this situation is what I would have chosen, but I am no stranger to adapting to difficult circumstances. I do not blame a child for the actions of adults." Thomas looked at her offered hand, then up to her face, searching for deception. He found none, only a regal pragmatism and perhaps a flicker of genuine compassion. With careful formality, he took her hand and bowed over it as he had seen courtiers do. "Thank you, Your Highness," he replied, the formal address awkward on his tongue. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You have good instincts," she observed. "You will need them at court." With that cryptic remark, she inclined her head slightly and returned to her place beside the throne. The king surveyed the assembly once more. "This court is adjourned. Let preparations be made to formally introduce Prince Thomas to the kingdom at a ceremony 3 days hence." He turned to a nearby steward. "Ensure that suitable quarters are prepared for my son in the royal wing." As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with the momentous events they had witnessed, the king placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder and guided him toward a side door, away from curious eyes and wagging tongues. They emerged into a small courtyard garden, a private oasis of greenery, enclosed by high stone walls. Here the sounds of the castle faded to a distant murmur, replaced by the gentle splashing of a fountain and the rustle of leaves in the afternoon breeze. "There will be much to learn," the king said, settling on a stone bench and gesturing for Thomas to join him. "Court protocol, history, statecraft, swordsmanship, all the things a prince must know. It will not be easy." Thomas gazed at the colorful autumn flowers, so different from the scraggly weeds that had been his usual view. "I've never been afraid of hard work," he said simply. The king smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his stern features. "No, I don't imagine you have." His smile faded, replaced by a more somber look. "Thomas, I cannot give you back the years that were taken from us. I cannot undo the hardships you've endured. But I can offer you a future. And I can offer you the truth about your past, about your mother, about the circumstances of your birth, about everything that led to this moment." Thomas plucked a fallen leaf from the bench, turning it over in his fingers. "I've spent my whole life hungry," he said quietly, "not just for food, but for answers, for belonging, for—" He hesitated, embarrassed by the vulnerability in his next words. "For someone to care whether I lived or died." The king's face reflected a pain so profound it seemed to age him years in an instant. "I have failed you in ways I can never fully atone for," he acknowledged. "But if you can find it in your heart to allow me a place in your life, I swear by all that is sacred that I will spend every remaining day trying to be worthy of being called your father." Thomas considered these words carefully, weighing them against his years of abandonment and struggle. He thought of his mother, of her unwavering love and her final wish that he find happiness. He thought of Lady Elspeth and her decades-old regret. He thought of Brother Thomas's cryptic advice to speak from his heart. "I don't know how to be a prince," he admitted finally. "I only know how to be hungry and afraid and alone, but—" He raised his eyes to meet his father's gaze. "I would like to learn how to be your son." The king's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Then let us begin with something simpler than princehood," he suggested, his voice rough with emotion. He rose from the bench and moved to a small table where a servant had left a covered tray. Lifting the cover revealed a loaf of fresh bread, still warm from the ovens, and a small crock of golden honey. "When I was your age," the king said, breaking the bread into 2 pieces, "my father would sometimes escape the burdens of the crown by taking me to the kitchens late at night. Away from courtiers and protocol, we would share bread and honey, just a father and son, nothing more." He offered 1/2 of the loaf to Thomas. "Sometimes the simplest traditions are the ones that matter most." Thomas accepted the bread, its warmth seeping into his palms, its yeasty scent stirring memories of his mother's baking on the rare occasions when they could afford flour. The king dipped his portion into the honey and took a bite, and Thomas followed suit. The sweetness exploded on his tongue, far richer than anything he'd tasted in his village existence. As they sat together in the quiet garden, sharing this simple meal, Thomas felt something shift within him, a space opening where hope could take root, not the fragile, desperate hope of his past life. Perhaps someone will share their scraps. Perhaps we'll survive another winter, but something stronger and more enduring. The future remained uncertain. Court intrigues wouldn't disappear overnight. Princess Marguerite's pragmatic acceptance might not extend beyond public appearances. The kingdom would undoubtedly buzz with scandal and speculation for months to come. Thomas had years of education to compress into a fraction of that time if he was to navigate his new world successfully. But in this moment, sharing bread with the father he'd never known, Thomas understood that he had gained something more valuable than a title or wealth or security. He had found a truth that had been denied him, the truth of his origin, of his blood, of his rightful place in the world. And with that truth came the beginning of healing for wounds so deep he had scarcely acknowledged their existence. "From this day forward," the king said softly, "you will never again know hunger or abandonment." He reached out, brushing crumbs from Thomas's cheek in a gesture of such ordinary fatherly tenderness that it nearly broke the boy's heart. "This I swear not as a king to his subject, but as a father to his son." Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the knot in his throat. Instead, he offered the simplest response he could, breaking off another piece of his bread and extending it to his father, completing the circle of giving and receiving that had begun with a hungry child at a royal feast, looking for nothing more than a crust to ease his hunger, and finding instead his rightful place in the world. Sometimes in life, the greatest treasures come disguised as our deepest hardships. Young Thomas entered a castle seeking only bread, but discovered his true identity and birthright. What would you have done in his place? Would you have had the courage to face a world of power and intrigue so different from everything you'd known? Or the strength to forgive those who had failed you? This tale reminds us that true nobility isn't found in crowns or castles, but in the capacity of the human heart to overcome bitterness and choose connection over resentment. The king could have denied his son to protect his throne, and Thomas could have rejected his father to protect his pride. Instead, they both chose the harder, braver path of reconciliation, beginning their relationship not with grand ceremonies, but with the simple sharing of bread. If you found meaning in this story of recognition, redemption, and the healing power of truth, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to our channel for more tales that touch the heart and challenge the soul. Remember, every one of us has royal blood in our veins when we choose to act with dignity and compassion, no matter our circumstances. Until our next story, may you find your own hidden treasures in unexpected places.